Okay, so picture this. It's morning, you're half awake, you open a cabinet, grab a box of cereal, pour it into a bowl, add some milk, and you eat it without thinking twice. It's the most normal breakfast in America. But here's the thing. The actual reason breakfast cereal exists, the real documented history behind it, is one of the strangest and honestly one of the most uncomfortable stories in American food history. Because the guy who invented cornflakes wasn't trying to make a tasty breakfast at all. He was trying to stop people from feeling sexually aroused. I'm not exaggerating. That's genuinely historically the documented reason cornflakes were invented. So today, we're covering the complete and bizarre history of breakfast cereal, from a health resort obsessed with controlling people's urges to an accidental kitchen mistake that created the flake shape we still eat today, to a bitter feud between two brothers that basically built the entire breakfast cereal industry. And trust me, by the end of this, you're never going to look at that bowl of cereal the same way again. Let's start at the actual source of all of this, a place called the Battle Creek Sanitarium, located in Battle Creek, Michigan, which by the late 1800s had become one of the most famous health resorts in the entire country. This wasn't a hospital in the way we think of hospitals today. It was more like a combination of a wellness retreat, a health clinic, and honestly, looking back at it now, something closer to a strict religious health cult, all rolled into one massive facility, complete with its own farmland, its own bakery, its own laboratory, and eventually its own resident population of thousands of patients staying for weeks or even months at a time. It was run by a man named Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, and Kellogg was, to put it simply, an extremely intense and extremely unusual person. He was a licensed physician, genuinely well-respected in certain medical circles at the time, having trained at Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York. But he also held some incredibly strong and honestly pretty extreme beliefs about health, morality, and the human body. Kellogg was a devout member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and part of that religious health philosophy at the time was this deep belief that most human diseases and most moral failings came from what they called unclean living. And a huge part of that unclean living, according to Kellogg specifically, was anything that overstimulated the body or the mind. Kellogg genuinely believed that civilization itself had made people sick, that modern food, modern excitement, modern indulgence had corrupted the natural human body, and that the only path back to health was through radical simplicity in diet, exercise, and daily behavior. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because Kellogg was absolutely obsessed, and I mean genuinely obsessed, with stopping what he considered to be one of the greatest threats to human health, which was masturbation. He wrote extensively about it, publishing entire books and pamphlets on the subject. He lectured about it constantly to both medical audiences and the general public. He genuinely believed that what he called self-abuse was directly responsible for basically every disease imaginable. Epilepsy, cancer, insanity, weak eyesight, heart disease, even something he vaguely described as moral degeneration. You name it, Kellogg somehow connected it back to this one specific behavior.
And Kellogg believed that one of the biggest contributing causes of this behavior was diet. Specifically, he believed that rich, spicy, flavorful foods, meat, heavily seasoned dishes, sugary treats, overstimulated the body and the nervous system, which in turn increased what he considered impure urges. So Kellogg's entire medical philosophy at the sanitarium was built around creating food that was as bland, as plain, and as unstimulating as physically possible. He wanted food that nourished the body without exciting it in any way, and this extended to nearly everything patients experienced at the facility, from strict exercise regimens to cold water treatments to bizarre devices Kellogg personally designed and patented, including things like vibrating chairs and electrical belts, all supposedly meant to calm the nervous system and redirect physical energy away from anything considered impure. And this wasn't some fringe side project either. This was the actual core medical treatment philosophy of one of the most well-known health institutions in the entire country, visited by presidents, by wealthy industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, by celebrities and public figures of the era. all coming to Battle Creek specifically for this strict, bland, controlled lifestyle, paying substantial amounts of money for the privilege of eating plain food and following an intensely regimented daily schedule. So, Kellogg needed a breakfast food that fit this philosophy perfectly. Something plain, something bland, something that wouldn't overstimulate patients in any way, but that was still nutritionally sound and easy for a facility to mass produce for hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients every single morning. And this is where his brother comes into the story, a man named Will Keith Kellogg, who worked at the Sanitarium handling a lot of the business and administrative side of things, essentially working under his more famous, more dominant, and by most historical accounts, fairly controlling older brother. Will was reportedly treated more like an employee than an equal partner for years, working long hours, managing the sanitarium's daily operations, while John Harvey focused on medical theory, public lectures, and his growing national reputation. The two brothers had actually been experimenting for years with different grain-based foods, trying to create something that fit John Harvey's strict dietary requirements, testing various combinations of wheat, oats, and other grains, looking for something digestible, filling, and completely bland. And then, according to the most commonly told version of this story, in 1894, something happened completely by accident that changed everything. The brothers had been working with boiled wheat, trying to press it through rollers to create a dough-like sheet that they could then bake into a bland, digestible food. One night, they had a batch of this boiled wheat sitting out, and for whatever reason, whether they got distracted, whether they simply forgot about it, the wheat sat out far longer than it was supposed to, essentially going stale and beginning to dry out. Now, according to standard practice, this batch should have just been thrown out, wasted, because who wants to work with stale, dried-out grain?
But instead, almost as an afterthought, they decided to run this stale wheat through the rollers anyway, just to see what would happen. And instead of coming out as one solid sheet, like fresh dough normally would, the stale wheat came out in individual, separate, thin flakes. Each little kernel had dried out just enough that when pressed, it flaked apart instead of sticking together into a solid mass. The brothers baked these flakes, and they turned out to be light, crispy, and honestly kind of pleasant to eat, especially compared to the mushy, boring, porridge-like foods most sanitarium patients were used to. This accidental discovery became the foundation for what they eventually called granose flakes, one of the very first flaked breakfast cereals ever created, and it was an immediate hit with patients at the sanitarium, who genuinely seemed to enjoy it far more than most of the other bland diet foods they were being served. Some reportedly requesting extra servings, which for a facility built entirely around restraint and moderation was a genuinely surprising reaction. Word about this new flaked wheat product started spreading beyond just the sanitarium itself, partly because former patients who had experienced it during their stay would leave and specifically request that it be mailed to them at home, creating this small but growing demand for a product that had originally been invented purely as a medical dietary tool, not as a commercial breakfast food at all. Patients began writing letters asking where they could purchase more, some even offering to pay significant amounts just to have boxes shipped directly to their houses across the country. And this is exactly where the story starts to shift, because while John Harvey Kellogg remained fairly rigid in his belief that this food should stay purely medicinal, strictly used within the sanitarium's health framework, his younger brother Will started seeing something completely different. Will started seeing a genuine business opportunity, a mass-market breakfast product that regular American families outside of any health resort might actually want to buy and eat every single morning. This fundamental disagreement between the two brothers ended up sparking one of the most famous and bitter sibling business rivalries in American corporate history. Will Keith Kellogg believed that if they added a small amount of sugar to the flakes, made them taste genuinely good instead of purely bland and medicinal, they could sell this product commercially to the general public and build an enormous business around it. John Harvey Kellogg was fundamentally against this idea because adding sugar directly contradicted his entire medical philosophy about avoiding stimulating, exciting foods that might, in his view, lead back to those same impure urges he'd spent his entire career trying to suppress in patients, and he reportedly saw his brother's commercial ambitions as a betrayal of everything the Sanitarium stood for.
The brothers argued about this for years, apparently with escalating tension at family gatherings and business meetings alike, and eventually, in 1906, Will Keith Kellogg made a decision that would completely reshape the American breakfast industry and honestly reshape his relationship with his brother forever. He broke away, formed his own company called the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, later renamed simply the Kellogg Company, and he started selling sweetened cornflakes directly to the public, marketed not as some strict health treatment, but as a genuinely enjoyable, convenient breakfast food that families could easily prepare every morning. And it worked. It worked incredibly well. Will Kellogg turned out to be a genuinely brilliant marketer, aggressively promoting his cereal through massive newspaper advertising campaigns, running promotions that offered free samples to anyone who mailed in a coupon, and he became one of the pioneers of including small toys and prizes inside cereal boxes specifically to appeal to children, understanding early on that if kids wanted a specific cereal, parents would end up buying it, regardless of what the parents themselves actually preferred, a marketing insight that would go on to define the entire cereal industry for the next century. This is also around the time an entirely separate but closely connected figure enters the story, a man named Charles William Post, who actually had been a patient at the Battle Creek Sanitarium himself years earlier, seeking treatment for his own health issues, reportedly suffering from severe nervous exhaustion and stomach problems. During his time there, Post became fascinated with the entire concept of health-based grain foods, and after leaving the sanitarium, he essentially took what he learned and observed and created his own competing company, launching products like grape nuts in 1897 and eventually his own version of corn flakes called Posties. Post became one of Kellogg's most aggressive commercial rivals, and the competition between these companies, all essentially originating from the exact same tiny health resort in Battle Creek, Michigan, helped ignite what eventually became a massive, sprawling American breakfast cereal industry, with dozens of competing brands popping up throughout Battle Creek specifically, so many, in fact, that the town became genuinely known as Cereal City, and at one point in the early 1900s, there were reportedly over 100 different cereal companies operating in that one relatively small Michigan town alone, all trying to cash in on this suddenly booming new market, many of them barely surviving more than a year or two before collapsing under the weight of intense competition. John Harvey Kellogg, meanwhile, remained deeply unhappy about how his brother had commercialized and fundamentally transformed his original medical invention, and the two brothers reportedly remained bitterly estranged for most of the rest of their lives, eventually even ending up in prolonged legal battles over who actually had the legal right to use the Kellogg name on cereal products, a dispute that dragged on for years through multiple courts, ultimately resolved largely in Will's favor, allowing his commercial company to keep the family name that would go on to become one of the most recognized brands on the entire planet. And here's the part that really shows how far this product traveled from its original bizarre purpose. Over the following decades, breakfast cereal transformed completely from this strict, bland, anti-stimulation health food into one of the most heavily sugared, aggressively marketed, kid-targeted products in the entire American food industry, with companies eventually competing not on health benefits at all, but on cartoon mascots, colorful packaging, and sugar content that would have horrified John Harvey Kellogg to his very core, given that the entire reason this food was created in the first place was specifically to avoid any kind of stimulation or excitement whatsoever. So the next time you're standing in a cereal aisle looking at bright cartoon characters plastered across boxes packed with sugar, or pouring a bowl of cornflakes into milk on a quiet morning without thinking twice about it, just remember, This entire product category exists because one deeply religious doctor in Michigan was trying to stop people from feeling aroused. His food happened to accidentally flake apart one night because someone forgot to throw out stale wheat, and his own brother turned that accident into a massive commercial empire specifically by doing the one thing the original inventor never wanted: making it taste good.